Ramel, let me start with you. I first encountered this work, Hale County, this evening, as a sample reel that you submitted to the Garrett Scott Development Grant. This is a small grant that I am on the administration of that helps bring first-time filmmakers to the Full Frame Film Festival for a weekend of mentoring. I can't remember what year it was that we awarded you the grant, but it was more than 4 years ago. 2014. I was going to say, definitely wasn't 14 years ago. Yeah, in 2014, then you had what I saw was 10 minutes of footage, some of which I see in that trailer, and you were still finding your way with it, and took you 4 years to come out to the other side. Can you talk about what you were trying to do with this film? As you know, if you haven't seen the the full film, you can get a sense from the trailer. It's a very visual film. There's not a lot of dialogue in it, and when I tried to represent it in my podcast before the Sundance Film Festival this year, and I'm always like looking for a line to bring it to life on audio, it was a real challenge because there's not that it's not an interview-driven film or anything like that. It's a visual poem. When did you know that that's what you were trying to do?
Thanks for having me, Tom. I think it would be really funny if you would have just had some ambient sound for that and just left it at that and been like, so what do you all think? I think it would have been funny despite the crowd's non-laughter.
I'm laughing.
I mean, I can imagine it being funny.
I'm the one who has to edit the podcast. So
Yeah.
Just imagine what a non-starter that would be.
Yeah, I think pretty early into the project, maybe 3 or 4 years, 3 or 4 months into the project, made an edit or two. And the edit very much resembled sort of the traditional language of documentary, specifically as it relates to the representation of Black folks and sort of the African American experience. And so sort of reflecting that what I consider to be a problem or sort of trap of knowledge or assumed knowledge, started to like build respond directly to like the content that was there. And then, sort of the mantra or the creed of the film began to like have a couple of goals. I think somewhere around like 5 or 6 like things that weren't as important, that weren't more important than each other, which I don't remember all of, but I can say like I wanted to sort of address the sort of trappings of narrative, the trappings of story. Wanted to use Black skin as content, sort of acknowledge that, the sort of the media landscape as it relates to Black folks is a sort of Rorschach test for your experience with the community, white or Black, or everything else. Wanted to sort of create a film that was an actual experience of what it's like to perhaps participate in someone's life and to be there, and in so sort of like precede words in some way. Yeah, I think those are the ones I kind of remember, but sort of working together.
And so to be clear, Hale County is a region in Alabama, and you're immersing yourself in the lives of 2 individuals, and that's what we're getting.
Yeah, it's in the Black Belt of Alabama, huge swath of land which had the majority of cotton plantations and really rich soil, and in so is sort of the quintessential hotspot for some of the social ills that we see in the U.S.
So, Sandy, in Shirkers, you are revisiting this film that you made when you were 19 years old that never got completed because your filmmaking partner had stolen the footage. When you started conceiving this as a documentary, what were you thinking of as the concept for this piece?
The concept for it was hard to come to, actually, because I first of all, I received the boxes of the film back, and it was arrived at my house in like 2011 and 2012, and I was already moved on. I kind of shoved this traumatic episode aside and had become a different person. I'd become a novelist, and having to revisit this was greatly traumatic. It took me 3 years to kind of open up the boxes and look at the film and think about what to do with this. One of the biggest hurdles was that I had to involve myself in telling of the story. I just didn't want to be in it because I'm also, like, as you can see from the footage, the trailer, that I was also the lead character in that old film from 1992, and part of me was just horrified at seeing myself. And one of the biggest hurdles in telling the story was, can I tell the story without myself being involved? And it was actually a friend, a great editor, Inat CD, who edited One of Us and Jesus Camp and The Wolf Pack, and she looked at my archive and looked at all the stuff, and she said, "Sunny, don't you realize you can't tell this story? It's about you," and then I had to deal with me. So I tried to kind of recapture what it was to be a kind of an 18-year-old before I made Shirkers, and just recapture what was roiling in my mind, and what before I could tell the story of the filmmaking and my friends who got involved and the whole thing. It was like basically trying to recapture the cadence and the rhythms of a life, like my life, and getting my friends involved in this. And one of the other things, of course, making a documentary rather than a fiction or just a personal thing where it's just me musing about this thing in a self-indulgent manner, was having to involve the other people whose lives were actually kind of, sucked into a black hole with the theft of the film as well. And that was getting in touch with my former friends, I guess, and that took a lot of research and persuasion and pain, getting them back into this thing and telling our story as a whole as well as just mine.
Tim, in the case of Three Identical Strangers, you came across this incredible story of these triplets who were separated at birth, and then there's another story beyond that story that unfolds in the film. A lot of this took place in the past, and so you were faced with a filmmaker's challenge of how do you tell a story that has largely taken place already. Although there are some things in your film that are unfolding while you're making it. What did you see as the challenges being set in front of you, and how did you learn how to grapple with them?
Thanks, Tom. I guess, I mean, my background as a filmmaker, I come from a really kind of, in the UK, we have a real kind of observational tradition, a kind of verite tradition of filmmaking, which is it's a very kind of prescribed approach. You don't have commentary, you don't have pop music, I mean, there's all kinds of kind of rules. And I guess quite early on, I realized to tell this story, I was going to have to use all kinds of different elements of filmmaking and break free of these kind of constraints from this observational technique. I think one of the things we've got is obviously some reconstruction at the top of the film. Initially, I was very reluctant to use it. I'm very ambivalent about reconstruction. But what I realized is for people to really go on an emotional journey with this film, which for me is what filmmaking is about. It's having an emotional connection with your audience. What I needed to do was align the audience with the brothers' perspective. And to do that, we had to encounter things and discover information as they discover it. So the perspective for most of the film is very much forced from their perspective. And so to do that, there are early scenes in the film where one of the brothers goes to college, and you saw in the trailer, and gets mistaken for someone he isn't. And there's no pictures of that time, because before they were famous, no one took pictures of them particularly. And so if we wanted to use that perspective and to follow their journey, we had to do that reconstruction, and that was a difficult decision to make, but I think it was the right one. But as Tom says, there are two very different kinds of filmmaking. I think they're almost different genres. You've got past tense stories where you've got archive, reconstruction, interview. You've got all these different kind of techniques, and then you have present tense, verite, and we have both in this film. And managing that transition between the two is tricky. There's a moment in the film where the guys in interview get up and walk out, and like the interview space suddenly becomes like a verite kind of observational space, and that wasn't something that we knew we were going to do coming into. And it was, we just left the camera running when they got up and walked out. It wasn't like that was planned. But I think very quickly in the edit, I realised, we needed something to kind of manage that transition, because the two styles of documentary are so different. Observational footage and observational filmmaking is very it's very loose. There's a lot more fat on it than there is on past tense stuff, where you can cut everything. Almost you can structure it like a narrative film. That's very tightly edited. Observational filmmaking has an entirely different rhythm, and so to make the two work, we needed this kind of decompression space between the two.
Sandy, in the interview I did with you on Pure Nonfiction, you talk about the importance of having a tribe as an artist. You talk about in Singapore, when you were a teenager, you had your tribe of people that you were able to make this first film. And then when you made the documentary version of Shirkers, you gathered a new tribe. And you talk about Anat Sidi as an example of someone who was a participant in this process. I'd love to hear from each of you, starting with you, Sandy, to talk about those other allies and advocates for your film, because each of you is trying to do something different. It's not that easy to explain. It maybe doesn't fit into a neat pitch box. And so how did people come to believe in what you were doing, and what did that mean to you?
It was extremely difficult trying to convince people to get involved in this thing. Because the footage, first of all, like I had to produce the 16 millimeter footage before people could believe that this thing existed and that looked the way it did, before I could begin pitching to other people. And finding a tribe, like I tried to make this film pretty much in the same spirit of the way I made Shirkers as a teenager, hand-picking people and just going at it and, believing in this thing together. So once, you're talking about, I guess, pitching and getting people involved and that kind of thing.
At any stage,
Yeah.
who were the kind of key people
It was really
who said,
hard.
I understand what you're doing?
Yeah, let me tell you, it was really hard finding a producer to want to believe in me and to know what I'm talking about and working on this alone. So I pretty much worked on this as my own producer, and a lot of people who were kind of more, advanced and well-connected were kind of horrified that I was kind of doing this alone and editing in my garage with an editor who was actually pretty much untried. But his name is Lucas Seller. I think he's really talented. He was very good at sitting with me and trying out things with me, and we discovered this. He's actually a skateboarder. I mean, he was actually discovered as a barista at Starbucks by Jeff Furzik when he needed an assistant on his film, Author, the J.T. Leroy story. And Lucas, it was just game. And so Jeff said, he recommends his Boy Scout, because I couldn't afford to hire a real editor, a grown-up editor. I didn't have a producer. It was just me. So I took a chance on Lucas. We kind of like really gelled on mood, and he was young enough to understand and kind of remember what it was like to be, hell-raising 18-year-old trying to make movies. He was 27 and a skateboarder. I was a little old to be a skateboarder by then. So we sat together and just like listened to music and built these collages. And I realized very early on, like maybe 9 months or a year before we even began working together, I needed a sound designer, because I wanted to get sound and soundtrack and the mood of everything in, because we were trying to take people into my head for the course of this movie, and it was very important that we utilize all the elements that were available to us in cinema. So that meant sound design, sound mixing, and soundtrack composer. So I found these, talking about tribe in the 21st century, I found these songs by the Singapore live looper. Her name is Wei. She was a school teacher, inspired by Shirkers. She quit her job, and now she's a professional musician, but she was a school teacher who had these two like wonderful songs she gave me, and I found this composer in Israel whose name is Ishai Adar, and he sampled her songs and kind of wove them through the soundtrack of this film. And I worked with him really early as well. Talked to him about 9 months before we began really working together, and then I worked with Lawrence Everson, who's a great sound designer in LA. We began talking. I mean, I wouldn't be able to afford working with him until right at the end, just before, picture locking and everything. But we began talking. This conversation, I think, was so crucial that 9 months to a year before I started putting ideas in his head, I showed him really just rough little 25-minute, cuts and just like bits and pieces, and just told him what I was going for and giving him words to work with in his mind so he could think about like how we had very little footage of this guy, George, who's still in my film, who's a primary figure in the film, and who has to loom like a ghost. But we only had a total of less than 30 seconds of him. So how do we maximize this? We have to have him, have a tang. Like, I said to Lawrence that he has to have this kind of, he was static personified. Wherever he appears, it's like absence and things like that. And so, Lawrence began thinking about this, even though we didn't begin to work together in his studio until the end. We kept having these like every month or so, we would check in and have these long conversations about the film. So it was like finding these collaborators and working with Lucas and, and then checking them with maybe not official producers, but people at Sundance, people at Cinereach who also supported this movie, who were crazy enough to support this movie and believe in me, and just checking in with them, and they kind of guided me throughout the way.
Ramel, let me ask you, when I met you in 2014, one of the things that struck me about you is, correct me if I'm wrong, but I felt like you were operating completely outside of the film world. You were a teacher, and you were a photographer, and you've been nurturing this project. You didn't have, producers or things like that. How did you, find those people? Who were the people that became, critical to you, to helping you realize your vision?
Yeah, it was. It's a pretty tough process. The film is sort of peddling in. Relatively decontextualized images from a larger narrative. They're like moments that are spontaneous and whimsical. And so the idea for the film is like, to create meaning by juxtaposition, by movements, by, many arcs and many sort of energies. And so, visual literacy, the person's like the teams of visual literacy has to be like extremely high in terms of like knowledge production. And so, I came across, fortunately, game changer, Jocelyn Barnes, really about halfway through the filming process.
So Jocelyn Barnes, who is sitting here in the second row, is a producer who's worked on a lot of very accomplished documentaries, works as a producing partner with Danny Glover.
Yeah, they have Lover Tour Films. Is our company, and they have made an amazing amount of aesthetically forward, politically relevant, but like deceivingly entertaining films. But I didn't mean to make people laugh at them. So came across Jocelyn Barnes. We like immediately connected, and from there it was like all happiness in some sense. Was really like sort of frustrated with the industry. There was a couple folks who had taken risk on me, like you, really early on, that saw something in what was going on, but the sort of expectations for clarity, the sort of expectations for,
Well, I can't remember in 2014 what I gave to you as advice, if I gave you advice.
I remember.
Okay, well, good. Because
should I say it, Tom?
Well, let me say this first.
Like this would be the last grant you'll ever get. Just kidding.
No. I feel quite positive that if I was saying anything, it was probably nudging you towards something more conventional.
Yeah. Well, it was, but simultaneously it was.
Maybe more than nudging. Maybe it was, do this, young man.
No, basically you were like, I don't know what the hell you're doing, but I like it. And I was like, thanks, Tom. It's really kind. You're like, meet these people. Maybe they can help you. But just to finish, so then we Jocelyn had worked with Soo Kim earlier on Strong Island, so we brought Soo Kim in, which also contributed to the film a bunch. And then we brought in Maya Krinsky, who is an artist and art critic that lives in Rhode Island as well. And then we brought in Rob Moss, who was also a game changer. And then we had like an edit team, so I would like edit, and then we would have these really long meetings in which we would all just sort of delve into meaning, the idea of meaning. In films, it's like really easy. I like to say it's really easy to create meaning, but it's really hard to avoid meaning. And for this film, in which you're literally peddling in just like images, like the capacity to undermine something, like some moment that you want to, some person to really connect with later on, is devastatingly, imminent at all times. And so that negotiation is really fickle. And yeah, I'm so happy with the team that came together to make it happen.
Tim, you had made some films before, but nothing as ambitious as Three Identical Strangers. Who were the people critical to you to help give you the confidence that you could do this?
Well, no one wanted me to make this film. I mean, no one wanted me to direct it. They wanted the film to happen, just not with me directing it. Normally when people talk about the struggle to get a film made, it took 4 years to get this one off the ground, and that was a nightmare in many respects. But the one thing that was great about that is it enabled me to very sneakily get myself so interwoven into the kind of DNA of the project that no one could get rid of me by the end of it. But I mean, initially there were all kinds of like Kevin McDonald type people being talked about for it. And so I'm very grateful actually ultimately to Raw, the production company I made the film with, as my exec producer Dimitri DOCNYC, who was the producer of The Imposter. They eventually decided to take a chance on me, and that was great. In terms of collaborators, I mean, the two key collaborators for me on this film were Becky Reed, who's the producer, who's got a kind of journalistic background, and she did a huge amount of kind of proper journalistic research on this film, going knocking on doors, trawling through archives, managed to get this experiment opened, which no one had managed to do before. And then the editor, Michael Hart, and all three of us, it was our first feature. And he's got a great story. I'm just going to tell you this really quickly. He's this guy, he's my closest collaborator. He came to London, wanted to be an editor, and ended up on all these reality shows and like hated it and quit, went back to Ireland, and that Christmas watched The Imposter, the feature film, at the cinema, and then was like, okay, I want to do this still. Moved back to London, and he looked up the production company that made it, and took whatever job he could find. And I was the exec producer on this not particularly brilliant series about Heathrow Airport, and Michael was like the last editor. We hired like the most junior editor, and he cut on this kind of docu-series about an airport, the best film with the dregs of the material, and he was clearly the most talented editor, and we had much more experienced editors. So from then on, we've had this kind of relationship. And on this film, at one point I was going to work with Danny Boyle's editor, who's a friend, and at the last minute he had something big come up that he couldn't turn down. And I think we were sort of going, oh, who are we going to get? And let's try Michael. And it's his first feature. He hasn't cut all that much stuff before this, and he just worked like a Trojan. I mean, we cut the whole film in 18 weeks, which for a feature doc is like really, really tight. And so the three of us, I think, going through it together as kind of quite naively as we did, was actually it's been a really good experience. And I think the fact that we didn't have anyone apart from Dimitri really super experienced attached to the project was a good thing, because we were all just trying to do our best and supporting each other through it.
I'm so envious hearing that.
Which bit?
All of it. Like having to work alone is incredibly lonesome.
Yeah, no. I mean, no. I think you're right. I mean, I think that the collaborative aspects of filmmaking are what I like. When people talk to me about, and I studied film and film theory at university, and people, learn about the auteur theory and everything. And I just, of course, you have a vision as a director, but the people you collaborate with are like, I wouldn't have got through it without them. It's a really tough film. So yeah, I mean, when yours are much more kind of personal vision films where you're like at the center of it. I mean, that must be so tough.
This is a question I should have asked off stage instead of on stage, but I'm going to plow ahead. Have the three of you seen each other's films?
Yeah, of course.
Okay.
Can I just jump in just really quick? I genuinely like really excited to be here, because when if you get a film that's kind of on the circuit and going around film festivals and stuff, there are a load of us going around and they're all good films and stuff. But genuinely, these two are like probably my favourite from the year.
Tim is the nicest guy in the world.
No, but they really are. Like Sandy's film.
Sandy, you said that before about someone else.
Yeah, she said that about everyone.
I was on the same stage as you.
Just to say, I mean, when I saw Sandy's film initially, immediately I was like, this is a kindred spirit, and like anyone who like loves cinema, not just documentary, but like all forms of storytelling, I was like, I just feel like I know you. And Ramel's film is not the kind of film that I would normally go and see. That sort of impressionistic, kind of more art end of the spectrum film. I went to see it at True Falls, and it honestly floored me. I was actually crying watching it. I mean, it just got to me in a way that I just didn't. I sort of someone invited me along to it, and it just really affected me on a kind of really, I don't know, fundamental level. So to be on a panel with these two guys is like really exciting for me.
Thanks, Tim.
We've been traveling together since then, and so we kind of like we're old horses.
Yeah, I haven't. I saw Sandy's film at True False, and I was like immediately hypnotized. And I haven't seen Tim's, but I told him that just watching the trailer, I was like, it's it's amazing. It's like unbelievable. And I told him it's going to come to all the theaters in my town, so I can't spend time watching it now. And he was like, I respect that.
This is what the kind of dialogue that I was looking for, because each of your films are so different, and so it's very interesting for me to hear you how each of you respond to each other's films. Sandy, I'd love to hear your reflections on either of these films.
Okay, that's putting me in a spot. Like,
That's what I'm here for.
I saw his film at Hot Dogs. Finally, I saw you doing a Q&A as well, and it was just like, it was great to see it on the huge screen, because I remember the screening because you were like kind of anxious that the aspect ratio wasn't completely correct.
They got the aspect ratio
And
wrong. It was a nightmare.
I'm like, we're completely the same person, so we're like, but it was great. I mean, like, this is a film that just gets you like from beginning to end, and it's just immaculate. I think it's immaculate. Yours is immaculate in a different way. I actually didn't see yours in a movie theater because the timing just didn't work out. But I saw it on a small screen, and I intend to rewatch it on a big screen. But it held me emotionally from beginning to end, which is hard for a film like yours, and with an attention span like mine.
People talk about finding a film in the edit room, and I've heard some of you talk a little bit about that, but I'd like to go a little bit more deeper into that idea. Ramel, can you talk about what happened in your editing process that allowed you to find your film?
Geez, Tom, that's probably the biggest question you could have asked, because like the film it's literally a puzzle, like it's not, and you could say that about any film, because all films are edited unless it's like one shot, but then it's kind of edited because you have a beginning and an end. But like there's varying degrees of puzzleness, and this is like a 1 million piece puzzle, specifically with, once again, like the capacity to like usurp something that you can't predict. Like the film is built to be a sort of like, like most films are interested in like walking someone through the woods. Like it's a path, like our film is like trying to put you in the woods and allowing you to just like have this experience of an atmosphere. And so the editing process was, it was actually quite fun now to think about it, because you get to, I think I'm not going to, there's too much to say, as I'm sure for the two other panelists as well. What I will say, because I've said it before, is that the most beautiful thing about the film is because we're intentionally dealing directly with someone's subjectivity and trying to engage that with as much agency as possible through openness and through ambiguity. You're confronted with your personal truth on a daily basis, which is something that is just important and generative, like I'm like, Joss, Rob, Maya, like this is what these 3 images are doing together, and this is how it's going to do this. And then Jocelyn's like, well, actually, I like this one a little bit shorter, and this is what it's doing, actually. And then Rob's like, well, both you two know what you're saying, but it's actually more like this. And then Maya's like, it's doing this. And you have to negotiate the way that you perceive the audience is going to respond to that in accordance with the spirit of the film. Like we're obviously carrying the way in which an audience views it. But I mean, yeah, so it was quite beautiful. Like you leave and you're like, I know myself better, because I have, people that I trust who have points of view that are conflicting with mine, that are just as true. And that's like really rewarding.
Sandy, you talked about the vitality of your collaboration with this former barista skateboarder editor, and the importance of Not CD earlier in the process, kind of setting you down the path of making this more a personal film. Once you were down that path, and once you were, in the groove of finding it, what else did you have to discover in the edit room?
Everything. It was, I guess it was like 9 months of me just sitting in my garage with Lucas, but it wasn't just completely 9 months with him. It was like, I worked with him for 7.5 months, and then he kind of was completely expired and exhausted and was just way too much because his skill was just, a lot of it was graphic, like moving things around and trying out moves with me, and like discovering the
Did you let him out of
story.
the garage sometimes?
Sorry?
Did you let him out of the garage?
Yeah, for smokes and what skating, I guess. But we, like the thing is, part of it was me not wanting George, because George loomed large, and within the editing, within
George being the
character who
missing
steals
character in the film.
yeah, the ghostly character. I got a new subject who was willing to talk during the edit. So I had to fly over to New Orleans and grab this interview and then insert it in, and then there was going to be like more George, and George was going to threaten to take this story away from us, and how do you stop that from happening? Is you just have to just really try out different things and just pull them out, like just take things out that are so tempting to leave in, storylines that just, are gonna like maybe hijack this film for a second time. So you don't do that. So I edited with Lucas for 7.5 months, doing the kind of coming of age story of me growing up and making this film, and then kind of growing up and becoming a kind of a detective of my own life and solving this mystery of what happened and gathering my friends and all of that. There came a point where Lucas, being a young man, and I knew this was happening, that he just didn't want me to seem unlikable as a female character. Like a lot of people are very afraid to go there with female characters, and I just knew that I had to work with a kind of an older, more experienced female editor. So I brought on a second editor whose name is Kimberly Hassett, greatly underutilized, greatly talented, and working mostly as a producer now, but extremely intuitive and talented as an editor. And she came on for the final 5 weeks, and
She would let you be unlikable.
Well, no. She, women are much harder on ourselves. We kind of would go there and talk about these difficult things, and some of the things the things I admit to that may not be so flattering, that are true to life, and because this is a documentary about me and my friends, I was so concerned that we had to reflect how things are and how my relationships with my friends are, and how it was that we got to make this film when we were 19, and what kind of personality I was, and what kind of person I am now. And we had to be honest in capturing that. So, so Kimberly went there with me, and that was completely instrumental and important in the process, where we then left these holes in the edit where I knew that I was going to be working with Kimberly, and then we would fill in these holes with deeper, kind of more mature understanding, and then from there we kind of fashioned the entire thing, and it became the seamless, beautiful thing with Lawrence's help, the sound designer who came in and just smoothed all the kinks.
Tim, compared to Hale County or Shirkers, Three Identical Strangers has more of a straightforward chronology to it. But I don't imagine that necessarily made it an easier process in the edit room. What were the things that you had to find in the edit room?
Yeah, I mean, we, as mentioned, we were like under real time pressure to kind of get through the edit. I mean, I think that although the narrative is quite linear in certain respects, and it's obviously quite a commercial film, I always felt like we were going to combine all these different aspects of documentary filmmaking, like I mentioned earlier, and definitely me and Michael, the editor, shared a lot of influences, from Errol Morris to, Asif Kapadia to James Marsh, people like that. We watched a lot of docs. We also watched a lot of, bad Hollywood movies, like, or average Hollywood movies, like the Michael J. Fox film, The Secrets of My Success, was like a reference point for the 80s. Sequences, and we were watching kind of a Bourne Identity for kind of the sort of identity thriller aspects of the film. I guess working out the biggest challenge with my film was working, because it works on, I mean, like all the good films, it works on different levels. You've got this brilliant family story, human story, quite tabloid, of these brothers separated, reunited, and then also separated again. But then you've got these other thematic arcs that are playing across the story, and we really thought a lot about them. About the film moves from a position of thinking, nature is really dominant and the importance of nurture. And it's also a journey of discovery, the experiment which separated the triplets, this secret experiment locked at Yale till 2066. There's also a sort of journey of discovery with the study going on there as well. So there was a lot to kind of interweave. And we really, the bits where we had it in the past tense, we really worked hard at kind of plotting it as tightly as we could. And I wanted things, seed information here and then pay it off here. And it was exciting for me to combine that kind of really meticulous, granular filmmaking with the kind of observational, investigative stuff where we don't know where it's going to go. And one of the challenges getting the film off the ground was people were like, what's the third act? Where's it going to go? And I was like, well, it's a documentary. That's the whole point. You don't necessarily know where you're going to end up. But I think because the first 2/3 or first half were so densely plotted and we could see all the story elements and stuff, the people really freaked out by that more observational aspect. And getting that all to work together was a kind of really screwed with your mind in the edit. We had, Post-its everywhere and graphs mapping kind of emotional arcs and all this kind of stuff.
Well, I think a special challenge in Three Identical Strangers that I remember experiencing when I first watched it is the first 10 minutes of the film is one of the most incredible stories you've ever heard. And I remember thinking, where does this go from here?
Yeah, I mean, you burn through so much story in the first 15 minutes. A lot of people have said to me, I just didn't know, I thought you just wasted it kind of thing. And there was a lot of pressure on us to make it more like a Netflix series or something like that. And there's certainly enough story to do that. But I always like films like narrative and documentary where there's like a surplus of story, where it's so dense that you actually probably have to come back and watch it again and you'll get something completely different from it. And I was always there's a lot of pressure on me to kind of make it into a series, and I was always really focused, like, no, this needs to be told in one sitting in a cinema. If people need to watch it again, that's fine. I'd rather have too much in than too little.
Yeah, when you asked me what I thought about that film, it was it seemed like such a seamless thing that was so easily done. But when I was watching it, I knew how difficult and all the kind of micro and macro things you were doing, and I was so impressed by the fact that it works as such an entertaining thing, and was a huge box office hit. But when you're watching it as a filmmaker, you're thinking, oh my God, all the work that has gone into this. That was what was going through my head in full admiration. So,
thank you.
I've been foregrounding style in this conversation, but I want to spend the last part of this talking about the interactions you had with the subjects in your film and the responsibility that you felt towards the subjects in your film. Ramel, you talked about one of your goals in Hale County as being wanting to do something different than other cliches and representations that you'd seen in other films. The lives of the people in your film are complicated lives, like anyone has a complicated life, and I wonder how you thought about representing them, and since the film has been out, how that relationship has evolved.
Yeah, good question. I will say though that there's there's a really to me a strong line between style and form, and very much I personally think that Hale County is peddling in form and not style. Style is very much veneer. It's very much trend. It's very much, and I don't mean those pejoratively. I mean those just to distinction. And form is very much the literal material of the sculpture, or the actual shape of it, not the sort of camera style or the. And so, with that being said, what was really important for Hale County was that you don't get to consume the film. You're not given the story or given the narrative, because if you, and this is coming from a very perhaps overly conscious African American photographer, artist, filmmaker, whatever, that is knows that most stories about black folks are connected to struggle, connected to slavery, connected to this, and they're given to people, and people consume them, and that kind of becomes the entire history, the entire narrative, the entire everything. And so to me that's a big problem, because I think that we're bigger than a variety of ways in which we've been depicted. And so how do you address those things? It's to like not let someone easily consume the protagonist or the characters, you know? Make someone invest their imagination, and then force you to reflect on the fact that, oh, I actually have only seen these types of representations, because now that I'm seeing this, like, this is new, but like, why is this new? Because it's banal. Has to do with, it takes a long time to get. Like, the film is very time forward, like very anti-industry, in that like you have to spend time to find these moments, which has not happened in the past. And so for those in the film, it was literally like we weren't even making a film because I spent so much time with them. You know, we were just hanging out, and I always had the camera. But we're just playing video games, we're like playing basketball, we're watching, you know, sometimes I'm filming, sometimes I'm not. We're literally just chilling. I like to say that I was like, you know, not there to capture their lives, but to participate in their lives, you know?
Ramel, can I just ask, I was really interested about this. Like, how much had you explained to them the kind of form that the film was going to take, and how much did your contributors think that they were just going to be in a, I don't know, like a normal kind of observational documentary?
Yeah, it's like impossible for them to know, but also for me to know, like, this project wasn't intended to be, I mean, it was intended to be seen, but like I had no idea. You know, I was 2.5 years I was shooting before the first grant we submitted to was the Garrett Scott. And so the guys didn't even know what Sundance was, you know. For me to go from shooting with this little camera and then for it to all of a sudden be in a theater with 300 people watching was kind of, I mean, it was jarring for even them. They were like, that's what we were doing the whole time? Because I'm just shooting and we're just hanging out, you know? Which I think is really fascinating. I was already making photos of them with my large format camera, and so they saw some of those and knew that like I wasn't interested in clarity, you know. I was interested in the unexpected, and so they didn't expect anything traditional. I told them that it would be like a sort of fractured narrative rebuilt together to do something, and they were like, all right, like, when are we gonna go get some food, you know?
Yeah. Sandy, in Shirkers, there are this group of friends that you went through this intense experience with in your teens, you know, different hurt feelings from that time, and now you had to come back and tell a story about it. What responsibility did you feel to the people that you were documenting, and how did that evolve as the film has been out in the world?
I just wanted to really capture what it was like to be friends and remain friends, you know, troubled friends, but, you know, female friendships are often troubled over time. And I just wanted to make sure that we captured the kind of texture of that in real life and just be true to that and be honest, and, you know, and so it was, I did a lot of, you know, coaxing of my friends to get involved in this thing, you know, because it's such a toxic subject, the whole George Cardona stealing the film and how it sucked our lives into this vacuum for, you know, 20 years before it was returned to me. All this kind of stuff was, the very mention of Shirkers just is so bad with me and my friends that it took a lot of coaxing and a lot of research into, you know, just talking to them and making, you know, just reaching out to them over like months before I began interviewing, and then hiring. I think one of the crucial things is hiring the correct cinematographer, who is who I picked Iris Ng, who's this really tiny Chinese-Canadian woman who had also shot Stories We Tell for Sarah Polley and had done similar, very intimate interviews where she was very unobtrusive. It was like, I have friends who are like these tall, gigantic Caucasian guys who were great DPs who were just mad at me for not hiring them, but it was just crucial for me when you're dealing with very nervous subjects who are going to reveal themselves to have somebody they were going to be comfortable with and who's gonna like vanish into, she's about this high, and like when she's shooting with a giant camera, she kind of makes herself into like this high, like she becomes really tiny. I mean, she's probably in the room. She's at DOCNYC. So I'm saying this for her friends, but you know, who know her, that she would vanish and just be poker faced. And so Jasmine and Sophie were just like talking at me as if we were continuing a conversation that we just had, and it was very important that we captured that truth of how we talk to each other, because we're not going to get a second chance. We're not going to rehearse. Like one of them, Jasmine, insisted that we had to run lines beforehand. I said, no, we're not going to. This is not a film. We're going to capture reality, and so we it was also like really important to just seem like it's casual, but to walk into a room and seem casual requires so much work and so much, like, I don't know, head work and just a lot of just preparation and walking in to people who are nervous, who are not used to being subjects, who some of them might be filmmakers and even more like conscious of being a subject. So having to overcome all of that took a lot of, preparation. And then you walk in and you seem like you're just winging it.
So, Tim, as we wrap this up, I want to ask about your relationship with the subjects in Three Identical Strangers. These are men who, particularly early in the cycle of this story, when it first became a news story, as we see in the trailer, that these three triplets separated at birth had rediscovered each other. They were in the media a lot, and not as much experience with that since then. Now you're telling what has now become the I don't know if I want to say the definitive version of their story, but the most known version of their story. What has that process been like for you and the responsibility you feel to those subjects?
It's really tough. They, as I say, it took 4 years to get off the ground. Part of that was getting funding, but a big part of that was earning their trust. When you see the film and you understand what they've been through, you understand why they find it hard to trust people. And also, around their 15 minutes of fame in the 80s, I think a lot of people promised them, we're going to make a movie with you and this and that, and it never kind of paid off. I was really worried that because they had done all this media stuff before, that they were going to be very jaded in the retelling, and it was just going to be like this rote, here's my story kind of thing. But once we finally persuaded them to do it, and once they agreed to do it and turned up, and the first day of interviews, I was like, we had the studio, we had all the lights set up, and I didn't know if they were going to show up. But when they did show up, they were just, what you're looking for as a filmmaker is kind of emotional honesty. That's where the connection between the audience and the contributors occurs, and I think sometimes people think documentary should be this dispassionate thing where we just kind of tell the facts of a case or a story or whatever. But I completely reject that. I think you're looking for emotional honesty and emotional truth. And what was surprising to me is when they sat down for the interview, they were willing and able to tap back into the emotion that they felt when they were experiencing this for the first time. And I think it may be just because the events were so seismic and crazy, that not just them, all their friends, they were there when they were talking about it. And I'd love to say, that's my skill as a filmmaker, and maybe that was a small part of it. But I think your film is only ever going to be as good as your contributors, and they were prepared to go to these emotional places that I didn't expect, and showing them the film at the end. One of the things that was amazing, they both loved the film, which was great, but we showed it to them separately because they weren't getting on at the time, which was, again, you can see it in the film, but it's a very hard part of the filmmaking process. And but separately, they both came up and hugged me, and it was like, it wasn't because they liked the film, which they did, it was because I followed through and my team followed through on what we said we were going to do. And just that simple act of doing what we said we were going to do was like such a big deal for them. It almost didn't matter what the movie was like. It was like, you did what you said, and thank you for that. So, yeah, but I just one thing to add, you guys out here in America, you tend to use the term subjects to describe people in documentaries. And I guess in the UK, the tradition I've been brought up in, we tend to call them contributors. And particularly on this film, because they were subjects of a human experiment that they didn't know they were part of, I always felt uncomfortable using the term subject. And I was very conscious, I think, that the power wielded by scientists over their research subjects is similar to the power we have as documentary filmmakers over our subjects. And it's really, when you point a camera at someone and you've got lights and you've got them in a room, you can ask them pretty much anything. And most people, they'll go there. And that's a huge responsibility. And I think it's incumbent on us to just be mindful of that every single day we're filming and we're editing.
Can I follow? Yeah, I never say subjects. I kind of openly reject it as well. I say protagonist, because it's just nice. It's like very forward thinking, but also it speaks specifically as it relates to Black imagery, like the sort of use of photography and film as science, as if there was like something legitimately scientific about reducing reality to a two-dimensional plane, And so I'm really happy you said that. And it's
Yeah.
such the scientific connection to yours is so damning. I didn't even think about that in terms of the idea of subject. That must be like painful for them to even hear. Like,
Yeah, and I think
Yeah.
also, and there were weird things in, just this minor thing about the character, but when you're getting people to talk about the kind of emotional things that they were talking about, in the past, the small documentaries I made in the UK, we'd always provide psychological counselling or a psychotherapist, as part of that process, just to support them. But there was a whole ethical debate we had to have about whether it was even appropriate to make that offer in the first place because of what they'd suffered at the hands of psychologists and psychotherapists. So it was the whole thing was quite fraught.
In my case, it was my subjects were my friends. I don't call them subjects because I was the only connection between all of the characters. So I mean characters, but they're my friends basically. And actually, I have to say that Sundance, when we showed this film at Sundance, was the first time me, Sophie, and Jasmine were the three protagonists in this film. I guess my film. Was the first time we were in the same room together in 20 years. So that was a pretty emotional kind of for them to unveil this thing for them to see at the same time as everybody else was seeing it. So that was pretty something.
can I say one more thing, Tom? I know you did the mic like a couple times. Like, Jesus.
Oh, shut up.
No, I wanted to say, from listening to Sandy talk about her film right before Tim went, one thing that I remember watching it is the honesty between the tension of her friends and herself lent like so much credibility to the story.
I agree.
And
That's my favorite bit.
yeah, like, and then she would like cut back to stuff, and all of a sudden, like, you could now engage in everything that's in the same way that Sandy's like, I needed to show people the film in order for them to believe that it happened. Like, once that happened, then everything that she was saying like took on a new sort of truth because no one's not no one, but like it's difficult to be real about like the problems you have with people. Like that's one thing you always
and
hide.
You just show.
Yeah.
You just show, and that behavior says everything.
Yeah,
It's so
good.
unsparing, your film. You don't give yourself. You don't soften anything towards yourself. It's really self-critical, and not just self-critical. Other people, you include other people being critical of you. But I just found the portrait of female friendship in there, just something I don't think I've seen before certainly in a feature doc.
I think it's crucial to have kind of mature female collaborators with me on doing that because otherwise it was just going to be me, fighting that battle and nobody wanting me to be unlikable. So if you're a female filmmaker trying to deal with difficult subjects, try to work with female filmmakers as well and try to get them on your side.